Okay, here we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, apologies for the slight delay. And apologies that because of the traffic from the airport, I have not really prepared this year. I must confess and apologize, so we're going to plod through it together. We'll help each other, okay, guys? Tumas Eichlin. Laws of the Tumah affecting food, chapter 14. Peiroi sheyorad hadela flitzoichon. When water from a drain pipe descends into produce and the owner mixed the produce so that it would dry, the produce does not become susceptible to impurity. So you have learned by now, because this is already chapter 14, so you all know the principle. By the way, I see Dennis Solomons is here. Mazel tov, Dennis, on his son's engagement yesterday.
Thank you, Rambam. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. And now, so you've already learned, and you're well familiar by now, I'm sure, that in order for food to become tameh, it has to be made wet before that. And it can only be qualified as being potentially contaminatable, is if once it was cut off from the ground. Obviously, everything gets wet because it rains, so that doesn't count. But once it's cut from the ground, detached, and then it becomes wet, then it is susceptible to becoming tomei should something tomei come in contact with it. So this first case in Halacha 1, it's a bit of a funny case. It's not a normal case. So water from a drain pipe came onto the produce. The owner mixed the produce so that it would dry. It's not the sort of a normal type of thing. I think we said that the owner has to want it to become wet. Did you learn that? That it has to be desirable to the owner that it should become wet. So this is obviously an exception. Number 2, Hamayle Peirosav Lagag. Person brings his produce up to the roof. In those days, many roofs were flat, and they was used either as entertainment areas or as work areas, or to dry your produce, or to let your produce, whatever. People kept stuff up on the flat roofs on top. So when a person brings his produce to the roof so that it does not become worm infested, and dew descends upon it, that does not count. It does not become susceptible to tumah. If he intended that the dew descend upon it, then it will. So if he dafka wanted the dew to descend on it, maybe it would help the freshness of his produce or whatever, then it will become susceptible, but otherwise it will not. Therefore, if a deaf mute or an intellectually or emotionally compromised individual or a minor, those are the three Talmudic categories which we read about all the time. In Hebrew, it's called cheresh, shoite, bekotan. Cheresh is a deaf mute. A shoite is an imbecile, someone who's intellectually compromised. That's a very nice way of saying it. I must remember this line. And someone who's intellectually or emotionally compromised. That is so respectful. That is so politically correct. Normally, we just say an idiot. Or somebody, or an imbecile or something. But obviously, it's somebody who's not right. So a deaf mute who cannot speak or hear, someone who's intellectually not right, or a minor who is halach, all of those three are halach in a halachic state and category of the because they are not intellectually capable of making transactions and of doing things which are they cannot be held responsible because of their intellectual impediments, either because of a physical malfunction or an intellectual or age. They're just not mature enough. So if any of those three categories, did I tell you once a rabbi made a bar mitzvah speech, and he says to the boy, he says, a special mazel tov that you left your bad friends behind. Nobody knew what he's talking about. So he said, he referred to the Talmud where it speaks about these three categories, the deaf mute, the imbecile, and the minor. So you've now left those other two guys behind, and you've become of majority age. Mazel tov. Okay, so for the minor, it's a question of time. The others, I don't think time will necessarily help. But while he's a minor, so he's still not halachically responsible. Therefore, if any of those three categories of people brought the produce up to the roof, even if they had the intent that the dew should descend upon it, it will still not become susceptible to impurity because their deeds are significant according to scriptural law, their deeds, but their intent, their kavanah, is not significant even according to rabbinic law. And here in the laws of tumah, where we say something to become susceptible to tumah, the owner has to want it to become wet. That is kavanah. That is a mindful idea, not a question of deed. And therefore, these three categories of people, since their intent is not, they're not responsible and mature and intellectually able to have the right intentions necessarily, therefore their intent is inadequate in this case. And if any of those three brought the produce up to the top of the roof, wanting it to get the dew to fall upon it, it will not make it susceptible to tumah. 3, when a person brings bundles of vegetables, dried figs, or garlic to a roof so that they will be preserved, and dew descended upon them, they do not become susceptible to ritual impurity, because why did he bring them up? Not for the dew to fall on it. That was not his intention. He did not necessarily want the dew to fall on his produce. He wanted it to be preserved, whether the animals won't eat it if it's on the roof, or the weather conditions are better, whatever. That was his intention. He was not looking for the dew. So therefore, the dew will not make it susceptible to impurity. We don't say that since everyone knows that dew will descend. I mean, what is he, an idiot? Surely he knows the dew is going to come down. So clearly when he put it up there, he knows the dew is going to come down and get it wet. We don't say that. It is as if the rationale is that he brought them up to the roof solely to show that they should be preserved. The dew was not in his mind at the time, and therefore it does not count. 4. When a person brings wheat to be ground into flour, okay? We harvest wheat, then we grind it, we mill it, and it becomes flour, and then we bake it. So when a person brings wheat to be ground into flour and rain falls upon it, if he was happy that it should become wet, it becomes susceptible to impurity. When his olives had been placed on the roof and rain descended, if he was happy, then they'll become susceptible to impurity. When donkey drivers were crossing a river and their sacks fell into water and they lifted them up, if they were happy that the produce became wet, then it's susceptible to impurity. If they're unhappy, then it won't be. The water that is on the sacks is considered as having been uprooted willfully, for they were happy that the sacks became wet. If they were not happy, obviously it depends what's inside the sack. So if it was produce and getting them wet will preserve them and they were happy, then it'll become susceptible to tumah. 5. When a sack was filled with seeds and was placed on the edge of a river, or at the opening of a cistern, or on the steps leading to a storage cavern of water, and because it's near bodies or places where there's water, it's going to get wet. It's not unexpected that they'll get wet. If they absorb water, they become susceptible to impurity. What is the logic here? Obviously, the logic, I would say, is that if you put it near the edge of a river, or near a cistern, or near a cavern, a body of water of one kind or another, you clearly are aware that there's a very strong chance that the water is going to reach these seeds and get them wet. So it's tantamount to willfully wanting it to get wet. Because if you didn't want it to get wet, you shouldn't have put it there. 6. When an earthenware jug containing produce was placed in liquids, or a jug containing liquids was placed among produce and the produce absorbed the liquids, again, it becomes susceptible. Why? Because whoever did it, if he has half a brain, knows that it's very possible that it's going to get wet. So when he put it there, we assume that he was aware that there's a very strong likelihood that it will get wet. And obviously, he's happy for it to get wet. And if he was not happy for it to get wet, he would not have put it there in the first place. Because he did, we assume that he desires it to get wet. Or at least he's happy. If it does, he doesn't mind. With regard to which liquids was the above said? With regard to water, wine, and vinegar. Other liquids are not absorbed through the walls of earthenware containers, causing produce to be made susceptible to ritual impurity. So if it was other liquids which will not be absorbed through the walls of the earthenware container, then maybe he didn't want it to get wet and he thought that they were safe. And in the end, if they did get wet, it would not be susceptible to tumah. But those 3, we know that they are absorbed, and therefore clearly he didn't mind that it should get wet, and therefore it will be susceptible to tumah. 7. Following rules apply when a person removes a hot loaf of bread from an oven and places it on the opening of a jug of wine. Why does he do that? He wants to say l'chaim on the bread. Not sure. If the loaf was from wheat flour, it does not become susceptible to impurity. If it was from barley flour, it does. Why? Because barley is absorbent. So barley will absorb the liquid of the wine, whereas wheat bread will not. Similarly, if the wine was impure, if the loaf was from wheat, it is pure. If it was from barley, it becomes impure. because it absorbed impure liquids. So that's just a physical difference between wheat and barley, that barley absorbs whereas wheat does not. We're learning all sorts of stuff here, You thought you're learning Torah. We're learning all about things. Gee, I wonder if my wife knows all this stuff, 8. When a person sprinkles water on the floor of his house and then placed wheat upon it, and it became moist. If it became moist because of the water, it becomes susceptible to impurity again, because obviously he was not displeased that it should happen. Otherwise, why did he put it there in the first place? If it became moist because of the stone, that's not what he intended, so it will not become susceptible. When a person washes his garment in a kneading trough, and afterwards he placed wheat in it, and it became moist, if it became moist because of the water, it becomes susceptible to impurity. If it became moist because of the kneading trough, it does not. So again, we can trace back logically what was this fellow's intention. What was he thinking when he put the stuff there? Surely he knew that there was a possibility that it would become wet from this, and not necessarily from that. So depending on what the circumstances are, that will determine if it becomes susceptible to tumah from becoming wet in these instances. 9, when a person buries his produce in sand so that it will become moist. I guess the sand was moist to begin with. It wasn't the Namib desert or the Karoo. It will become subject to impurity because clearly he knew. When he buries it in dry mud, if the mud is moist enough that a hand that touches it will become wet, the produce becomes subject to impurity. If not, it does not. So in halacha, it's called toifeach al manas latviach. Is something wet enough to make something else wet? In halacha, we find a definition. It's used in kashrut, in the laws of kashrut. How do you define wetness? So in certain instances, to be categorized as wet, it has to be wet enough to impart moisture to the things it touches. Sometimes you touch something and you don't get wet from it, even though it might be somewhat moist. But if it's really wet, then it'll make you wet when you touch it. 10. When a person sprinkles water on his grain heap, he need not worry that his wheat became susceptible to impurity. If the kernels came in contact with water, even though he is satisfied that this happened. He sprinkles water on his grain heap. So clearly he knows, and he's satisfied. But he still says it will not become susceptible to tumah. Why? That's a good question. I'm not sure. I don't know. We'll have to look into that. 11. When a person gathers grasses upon which dew had descended to use for covering wheat, so the grasses are now moist from the dew, and now he's putting the grass, which is somewhat wet, on the wheat. The wheat does not become susceptible to impurity. If, however, it was his intention that it should become wet, then it will become susceptible. That's logical. That I understand, because he wanted to cover it. He wasn't looking to make it wet. But if he was, then it will become tumah, or susceptible to tumah. 12. When a person sprinkles impure water on the floor of his house and then placed stalks of grain there and they became moist, they become impure. If there's enough moisture upon them that the hand of one who touches them also becomes moist, as we said before. If not, they are pure. It's not called wet enough to make it tumah. If it doesn't make you wet when you touch it, it's not wet enough. 13, when a person shakes a bunch of vegetables that had liquid on them, and because you shook it up, the liquid descended from the upper ones to the lower ones. So there's a bunch of vegetables, there's water on top. Now you're shaking it so the water hits the ones on bottom as well. They do not become susceptible to impurity because we're assuming, I'm speculating, the reason is because it was not his intention that the bottom one should become wet. He was shaking it because he wanted to shake it, shake it up, shake it, baby. But that it was not his intention to make them wet. And with this, we said before, everything is to do with intention. 14, when a person lifts a sacks full of produce from the river and places them one on top of the other. Now, clearly, the one is going to wet the other. So the lower one becomes susceptible to impurity because of the water descending from the upper one, for he willfully placed one on top of the other. If he didn't realize it's going to get wet, then he's also one of those imbeciles. So clearly, he realized that it's inevitable, and therefore, we assume that he was pleased that it should become wet. 15, when a person blows on lentils to see if they are good for the purpose of cooking. Any cooks here at the shir? Huh? Any of you ever blown on lentils?
Never.
Have you ever cooked lentils, Mark?
Nope.
Dave, have you ever cooked lentils?
Nope. I've eaten cooked lentils, but I haven't cooked them myself.
Oh, does your wife blow on the lentils?
Maybe she did.
Did Jacob blow on the lentils when he gave it to Esau? That's the big question for the day. When a person blows on lentils to see if they are good for the purpose of cooking, if water collects on them, they become susceptible to impurity because of the moisture in his breath, derivative of water. There were some rabbis who were notorious that when they spoke from the pulpit, a lot of saliva came out. There were people who refused to sit in the front row for that reason. They were afraid that they would get showered if the rabbi got too excited in the sermon, Anyway, so here we see that it's that there is moisture in our mouth. So when you're blowing, you're not intending to spit, but because there's moisture in our mouth, saliva, it can make it susceptible. 16, when a person bites food, so now it's been in his mouth and his mouth is wet, and then it falls from his hand. So maybe he's holding an apple and he takes a bite of the apple. It's quite, there's nothing wrong with the etiquette in holding an apple and taking a bite. And then the apple fell out of his hand. The liquid on the food from his bite is not considered as having been placed there willfully. When you eat an apple, I had an apple yesterday. I don't eat apples every day. Yesterday I had an apple. Was it my intention in eating the apple that I should make the apple moist from my mouth? Never occurred to me. I'm eating an apple. I want to eat the apple. That's all. I'm not thinking about making the apple wet. So it's not considered as being placed there willfully. If a person was eating olives that had been broken open, or moist dates, or any other produce whose pit he desired to suck, yeah? Who likes olives?
Yeah.
Not me, but some of my kids love olives. I always give them mine because I don't like olives and they do.
It's an acquired taste.
Some people like to suck the pits. Some people suck marrow bones, and some people suck olive pits, and some people suck both. So, but it fell from his mouth. The liquid on it is considered as having been placed there willfully. Why? Because he wanted to suck it. If he was eating dry olives, dried dates, any other produce whose pit he does not desire to suck, and it fell from his mouth, liquid on it is not considered as having been placed there willfully, because that was clearly not his desire or his intention. And finally, 17, we have already explained that when a person gathered endives, which is lettuce, type of lettuce, right? We use it for the Seder, for the Morah. Why can you use endives for bitter herbs? You know why? It's not bitter when you taste it. Why does endives qualify for maror, for bitter herbs? Who knows? Because the roots are bitter. Okay, that's just a PS. We have already for when a person gathered endives for an animal and washed them, but changed his mind afterwards and thought to use them for human consumption. They need to be exposed to water a second time in order to make those foods susceptible to impurity, because his original intention in wetting them was not for human consumption, was for animals. Animals could eat tumah, it doesn't matter. Now, for wetting, he would have to wet them again. If, however, there was tangible moisture on them when he thought to use them for human consumption, they are susceptible to impurity. Quick quiz, 4 questions. When water from a drain pipe descends into produce and the owner mixed the produce that it would dry, does the produce become susceptible to impurity? That was the first halacha. Were you here on time for the first halacha?
No.
Yeah, thank you. Which of the following statements are true? The deeds of a minor are significant according to rabbinic law, but their intent is not significant even according to rabbinic law. That's true. The deeds of a minor are significant according to scriptural law, but their intent is not significant.
It's not significant.
Not significant according to rabbinic law. What's the difference between 1 and 2? Oh, scriptural. Oh,
Scriptural versus rabbinic.
Sorry. The deeds of a minor, the deeds of a minor significant. Yeah, 2 is true.
2, yeah.
The deeds of a minor are significant according to scriptural law, but their intent is only significant. No, 3 is not true. So I would say definitely we learned about 2, the middle one, B.
Yeah.
But if it's the deeds of a minor are significant according to scriptural law, the question is, are they significant according to rabbinic law? Might not be. So let's say this one is correct. And it looks like that's the only one that's correct. Okay.
Yeah.
If one brings up vegetables to his roof, store them there, and dew descends on them, do they become susceptible to tumah or not?
No.
Well done. That was not his intention. And finally, when a person sprinkles water on his grain heap, does he need to consider that the wheat kernels may have come because of impurity?
No.
The answer was no. We were wondering why.
Yeah, why? Why is it?
We didn't.
3.
I confessed my ignorance that I wasn't sure why. Does anybody have a suggestion as to why? Let's look it up.
Because the intent was to
Because
make them wet.
And it was not his intention.
It was an intent. When you sprinkle water on something, your intent is to make it wet.
Yes.
This is sprinkles water on his grain heap. He need not, number 10. He need not worry that his wheat became susceptible to impurity if the current got with water, even though he's satisfied that this happened. Why? Why is this halacha so? Anybody have an idea why? I wasn't sure.
No.
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 Rabbi, I have a different question for you. When we talk about something becoming moist, we're talking about the 7 listed liquids. Am I correct?
Sorry, a lot of feedback coming from somewhere. Let me try and silence it. Okay, I think I did. Now I can hear you. Start again, Kent. What was that?
So when we talk about things becoming wet, we're talking about the 7 liquids, the water and blood and honey and etc.
Yeah.
Yet in paragraph 6 of today, it refers to vinegar making something wet. And that's the first time we've heard vinegar being referred to as a liquid, which can make something susceptible to ritual impurity. Any thoughts on that?
Was vinegar not on the list?
Not on the list of the 7, no.
No.
Okay, that's an excellent question.
Mm.
Let's see. When an earthenware jug,
They talk about chometz. I mean, that's vinegar.
sorry, what was the last thing you said?
And so in the Hebrew, it talks about chometz, which is vinegar. You know, I was looking just to see that the
Chometz.
translations.
Chometz, not chometz. Chometz is vinegar. Chometz is leaven on Pesach.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, that's okay. You stumped the zoo. I'm not sure. Good
Okay.
question.
Okay.
Okay,
Thanks, Rabbi.
okay. I'll give
Thank
you.
you.
You can tell me next week. Okay.
Thank
Cheers,
you.
everyone.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Rabbi. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Cheers.
Have a good week. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Rabbi.